Hi, I'm Dr Melissa Gustin. I'm the curator of British art at National Museums Liverpool, and I'm also the curator of Turner Always Contemporary at the Walker Art Gallery from October 2025 to February 2026. I'm super excited to do a roundtable discussion today about the women artists that we're including in the exhibition. And I'm joined with Amanda Draper, Amah-rose Abrams, and Lydia Figes. And I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I think I'll kick off with a really basic question. You've all had a chance to hopefully look over the draft of the catalog text and the content list. And one of the things as curators I was really keen to do was to include women artists as much as possible and really draw from our own collection at National Museums Liverpool, but also with a couple of really exciting loans or acquisitions. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of first thoughts about the women artists that we've included, or what that might mean in 2025 to include women alongside somebody like Turner.
My thought was that you would be hard-pressed to find a professional landscape artist who's contemporary to Turner. So I think you've been clever in broadening the historical perspective of it. I mean, when you look back at what was happening with women artists during the first half of the 19th century, it's appalling, really. Excluded from the Royal Academy schools, they weren't part of the Royal Academy management, no academicians, and it went on for 100 years. So, yes, I think it was of necessity, but also a great way of making it more live for contemporary audiences.
I was struck by some of despite obviously they weren't contemporaries of his, but I felt that looking at the women that you chose, I was thinking about how each of them were quite radical, even coming up to most recent artists featured. And I was struck by how I was trying to kind of draw parallels between them and Turner. I guess that's the natural thing to do, perhaps. And I was thinking about them as characters and how a lot of them are quite singular, like Turner. I mean, it's very, very obvious observation, but Maggie Hamling, I feel like has quite a strong.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. She's like a counter figure, and proudly so, I think. And then I was thinking about the characters of all these women, and then I was also thinking about their relationship with the sea, and this kind of relationship with British landscape and the weather, and this emotional kind of component we have with our ever-changing skies, and how each of these artists has engaged with it really differently.
Yeah, just to echo what Amah was saying, I think it's interesting to look at the list of women featured and how some of them maybe could be perceived as outliers or mavericks, in the sense that they sort of had to turn away from academic traditions, largely because they were maybe ostracized from them. And that's how they sort of define their careers, in a similar way to how Turner sort of did things his own way, perhaps with a sort of stubborn streak. And also the fact that, Emma Stibbon, Annie Swinnerton, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham were sort of walking in the landscape, a lot of very sort of engaged with nature, and sort of embodied in the landscape, and that really informed their work. And that also connects to Turner, perhaps, and his travels around Europe and the UK coastline. So I think that's what kind of drew me and struck me.
Were there any works in particular that sort of leapt out at you by these women? Some of them have two, some of them have one. But from looking at that list, was there anything sort of in particular that jumped out at you about them in that sort of Turner way?
I think, as Amah says, Maggie Hamling, it struck me. I thought, why have there never been a two-hander exhibition before Turner and Hamling? They so approach the sea and weather in this expressionistic, gestural way, really moving with the paint, really wanting you to feel the emotions that they felt at the time. I don't know, maybe Hamling had never wanted to, but I'm really surprised that that's not happened.
Well, she's picked that one herself for this, so I was lucky enough that I just emailed her and said, please. So she's actually selected that canvas as the one that she thought most closely resembled it. But I think she's best known for thinking about Constable, and she has sort of said she likes Constable a bit better, which might be why. But I thought she was such a figure with that power of the sea to be able. She was one of the first artists that I approached about being involved. I think exactly because of that concern with the power of the sea, and so that painting is going to sit in dialogue with our Turner Wreck Boy, which is, I think, our most important famous oil painting, and it's all about that crashing violence and surge. So I'm really glad that people are enjoying picking up on that one.
I read the quote from Hambling, I'm probably not going to say it correctly, but that she prefers Constable because whereas Turner embeds himself into the landscape and seascapes, and it's almost about him, Constable is more kind of observing nature as it is, slightly more objective, perhaps, slightly safer. But then I think that's quite interesting when you compare Turner with Maggie Hambling, because I see the connection between their work much more, that she was quite radical and experimental at what is in her style. So it's sort of surprising that she likes Constable more.
I wonder if it has to do with just where she's based, and she really is sort of in Constable country. But I think of the quote that she's written about the sea and sort of the crashing wave being sort of death and sex. And so for her to sort of prefer Constable for his study rather than that really personal violence and sort of relationship with the sea is really interesting when she talks about the ocean and her paintings of it in such a personal language. I think the phrase it's got me by the short and curlies to talk about this return to the sea painting over and over and over again.
I'm thinking about Turner and what speaks to people now about him and what makes some of his paintings feel very contemporary. But I think that is what Lydia was saying, him in the painting, the way you very much sense the artist in the painting emotionally, his presence is there and instantly recognisable, especially as we go on through time. And I feel like with some of his contemporaries, that just wasn't the case. And at the time, I think that's what people didn't like, but it's what has maybe endured.
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it, is he is so identifiable and he's so iconic now, but that was what got him sort of rejected by critics and things. But it's also what makes him so powerful, I think, for sort of a theme of the exhibition around how has one artist always been reinvented and rediscovered and always sort of contemporary. She did the thing where she put the title of the exhibition in the conversation. But that, I think, maybe brings on to one of the things around women artists is, how do we see potentially women artists, the ones that are in the exhibition, but also sort of more broadly, as engaging with some of these themes, or the idea of being contemporary. We've got our women artists from the middle of the 19th century to working immediately now, responding to these themes. So I was wondering what you sort of thought about that idea of contemporaneity by women.
Yeah, I mean, I guess how would we define what is contemporary? And I think if we're applying it to Turner, perhaps it's the willingness to take risks and not be conformist, not just stick to what the establishment or the academy wants. And I think Turner definitely is the epitome of that, and why he had his detractors and his critics. And I think, maybe we could talk about the double standards of art history and how gender played out. But I think when women did take risks, perhaps it wasn't received so well and they were marginalized even more. I think if you look at the work of Sheila Fell, yep. Sheila Fell. I think her work is really interesting because you can kind of see this darkness and violence in her landscapes of Cumbria. And I think it's maybe understandable why, well, it's unfair, but maybe understandable why she wasn't a household name in her lifetime, and sort of now she's having a reemergence, but was not as celebrated, because in a way it's quite a sort of unexpected and challenging subject matter for women of that era. But you can see the connections to Turner, I think, and his commitment to observing landscape in a sort of subjective, expressionistic way.
I'm glad you brought up Fell, because I must admit, when I read the catalogue, and I thought the Sheila Fell very much grounded in this one singular landscape, which is of her background and where she grew up, coal miner's daughter. And of course, he was terribly peripatetic, travelling around. That was part of his income stream, but then he just loved to travel. So that I'm not sure that I recognised that link so much. Then I thought more about Fell's biography. And I'll tell you what I did was watch the short Monitor film. Did you watch that? So she's been interviewed in 1963 by Melvyn Bragg. They went to the same school. So in what's now Cumbria, what's then Cumberland. And I expected when she started speaking, she'd sound like me, very northern, flat vowels, and she didn't. It was absolutely received pronunciation, very BBC. I can't do it for obvious reasons. And I was amazed at how she sounded. And I thought it looks to me like she's had to reinvent her whole personality to fit in with the London art establishment. And I think she went to Slade, she taught at Slade, didn't she? And she was successful in her day. She's in quite the National Collections, quite a few other collections. And that I can see parallels between Fell and Turner in that, and that he had to really drag himself out of his own backgrounds, which was his dad was a wig maker, so like lower middle class, working class, and almost reinvent himself to fit in with the London art scene of the day. And I know he's very particular about clothing, wasn't he, in his young day? So again, two people who had to reinvent their personalities to fit into, to be successful in their time. What also, and I'm on a rant now, what also struck me about Fell was she did develop alcohol addiction, and it was a reason for her early death. And I thought, I wonder how much of that was caused by her having to live this duality, this polar life, where her art and her personality was grounded in the North, but she had to fit in, look the part, sound the part in the London art scene.
Yeah. I was thinking about that because I read that she was part of the Soho scene. Mm-hmm. Like, friend of Frank Auerbach, Leon Kossoff. She was also, to support herself at university, she was also a model. Thinking about contemporaneity, I was thinking about her story, if you told it now, I imagine would be kind of the ideal magazine, profile. Oh, she's a model, she's at art school. Then it wasn't like that. It would probably be considered, oh God, she's a model. Or she works, is she focused? And I think, to what you were saying, I think she must have been having to work incredibly hard to maintain all these different aspects of her life in order to paint. And I wonder if there's something to be read into her constant return to the lakes, to paint where she was from. Is there something grounding in that? Is there something, if in an ideal world she wouldn't have lived in London, she would have stayed up north and just painted the landscape. It's thinking about how, even though she's not, she's a recent artist. Yes. How much things have changed even in that short time for women and for artists and for the perception of artists.
Yes. I guess if you think about what Sheila Fell was focusing on, so landscape, I guess, sort of 50s, 60s, the art scene was shifting and becoming more conceptual. It wasn't as fashionable to stick to landscape. So I think that's quite interesting about her, that she sort of defiantly just stuck to what she knew and loved, which also I think resonates again with Turner, that he was just sort of this recluse and just kind of sort of became an outlier and just preferred to do seascapes and coastlines. Rather than sort of pandering to what the fashion was, which I like about her.
I do like that. And I think that she does have this really interesting biography, but she has got this great quote right before she died. She was interviewed 2 or 3 weeks before she died, that she said that she wanted to keep painting. She had enough subjects to keep her going until she was 104, but also that she had been to Greece. So she had a relationship with a Greek sculptor, had a child, but that she'd been around all of the tourist spots in Europe. She'd been to France, she'd been to Italy, and that she just found them boring. She didn't like painting them, and that she found them really uninspiring. And I think it is part of that familiarity. But I also think about the fact that when she was very young, she was supported by the council school. She went to the National Art School. She was supported by the state to be trained as an artist. But when she went to the local art school, her teacher said, well, you shouldn't be a painter. You should really just, have you considered textile design? That's a bit more so
Very dismissive.
very
Yeah.
dismissive. And then, she ends up at St. Martin's sharing a studio with Frank Auerbach. So there's a real interest. It is very gendered, but I found the fact that she's also very much supported by Ellis Lowry, who they used to go on sketching tours together around the lakes. But one of the things, that is one of my absolute favorite paintings in the exhibition, and we managed to get it conserved last year with new glass, and it was cleaned so that it can go on display. But that is one that I think doing an exhibition like the Women Landscape Show we did last year, or the Turner this exhibition this year, it really is letting us get women artists out of the storeroom from an institutional perspective that otherwise, we are equally guilty as an organization of having these women artists who, we know and we love, but haven't been able to share those stories, this passion, these relationships with the intellectual heritage of landscape painting, because somebody 50 odd years ago just put it in a storeroom. And so it will, after this exhibition, go out on long-term display along with the Ethel Walkers that we've also managed to get out. But it is interesting thinking about her contemporaneity with other artists, but also thinking about this, her relationship to coal mining, as you said, to class, but also to these questions of climate change, which is one of these big narratives in the exhibition. And I'm wondering if anybody has thoughts. We've got Emma Stibbin. We do also have Amy Swinnerton, who seems to be fully not negotiating with these subjects at all, compared to, somebody like Sheila Fell or Emma Stibbin in these dialogues.
Yeah, it's sort of an obvious point, but I think people know that Turner's engagement with the sea and the landscape was a sort of not environmentalist, because it's too early in history to attach that word to him, but definitely concerned about what industrialization was doing to the landscape and humanity in general. And I think what interested me by comparing Emma Stibbin's work with Turner is, whereas Turner sort of shows the subliminal, wrong word. Turner shows the sublime aspects of nature and it's sort of overwhelming humans and being this force of nature, this huge thing. I think Emma Stibbin's work is about more about the fragility and the erosion and disappearance. So I thought that was quite an interesting comparison. And obviously she directly does take from, or she's directly influenced by Turner. So it was nice to see that kind of contrast.
Yeah, I was thinking about the was it Grindelwald, and Turner painting Grindelwald, Graham Barnes painting Grindelwald, and then Emma Stibbin also painting the same landscape as it changed over time. And that made me think about climate, the fact that those glaciers captured by Graham Barnes and Turner are no longer there when Emma Stibbin walks in his footsteps. And that, I think, says something so fundamental about climate change. It almost is beyond words, because it's a literal documentation. Yes.
One of the things that we've tried to do is to forestall the complaints that I will still inevitably get from the right-wing press about being a left-wing wokey curator who's destroying Turner's reputation. Can't wait to get these emails. To really ground it in the things that you see in the Turner watercolors in particular, around the development of coal consumption and fossil fuel consumption, and how the direct impact is seen in his lifetime, and that he documents this and then Ruskin documents this, and to really sort of try and challenge this idea that this is a post facto projection, but that these are things that in the actual works that we're showing, you can start to track these changes, and then they become this full-flowered engagement in Emma Stibbin's work, but also to look at some of the works that are avoiding this, even as it is known in these sort of landscapes. So I think that this is, and we were very lucky that Emma Stibbin was really supportive of our acquisition of these works for this exhibition, and we're really hoping that it kickstarts an area of collection for us that is engaging, particularly through women artists, because that's sort of the curatorial team's real passion, but to really think seriously with the collection about what we can do as an organization through exhibitions like this, which do have a massive fossil fuel footprint for the amount of transportation that we're doing, the build, things like that. but to really factor these in, not just from the position of including the works, but from that curatorial back of house perspective as well. Just going to check my notes now.
I'd be interested
Yeah.
to know more about what you know about Emma's connection to Turner and what she sort of said, or her sort of research into his work.
Yeah, so she's talked about, really, there was an early project that she did with the BBC around going up the glaciers and explicitly, not even in a metaphoric sense, but explicitly following Turner and Ruskin's footsteps up the glaciers to document that lack of ice that was noted in sort of Ruskin's lifetime. And so it was a very explicit, direct response to this. And so she has spoken very beautifully and talked about the artist's responsibility in sort of today to respond to the climate crisis, and to the fact is that this is something that is directly materially rooted in the events that happened in Turner's lifetime around, the Industrial Revolution, the mass consumption of coal, the fact that the British Navy is one of the major factors in the move from coal mining to liquid fossil fuel consumption, because the quality of coal that was being mined in the UK was insufficient in both quality and quantity for the amount of fuel that the British Navy and the Merchant Marine needed during the late stage colonialism of the empire. And so that is so materially present in Turner's work that you can see the impact of that. And we are lucky that we're borrowing some Ruskins, as well, as annoying and not particularly feminist as he was, because he wrote in the 1880s, The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, which was about how he could document from his childhood the changing weather climate, the climate, the weather patterns, the wind patterns, the way that the sun was refracting through different kinds of clouds. And so Emma has such a scholarly understanding of what these historical documents say and these artworks say, and her practice is so rooted both in place, in the use of inks that are made from local seaweeds or chalks that are made from local chalks and things like that, but also daguerreotypes and cyanotypes that are based in these Victorian art practices. And so it's this multi-layered engagement that I find absolutely fantastic. And I was actually introduced to her work because of the Ruskin, Turner, and the Stormcloud exhibition in New York in 2017 that she was commissioned to make large-scale works for, because of that original BBC trip up the Grindelwald Glacier to track this. So it's been a really long-standing engagement for her. And so I was so excited that she was supportive of this and was happy to be involved and to work with us to acquire these pieces, which are the first of her works in our collection. So it's been really fantastic. And they close the show. They're the last thing you see in the exhibition as you go out through the door. And I thought that was really important to close on a woman artist engaging in so many different levels with this dialogue. And also she's just really lovely. She's just really nice. And so we've been really lucky that all of the living artists that we've been working with have been so supportive of the project, and to be able to articulate these things for us and to give us quotes to use in the catalog and on the wall text, and to really let them speak for themselves rather than me sort of ventriloquizing what I think their work says, but for them to be able to say, this is what this work means, this is what it means in the context of this exhibition, to really let particularly the women artists, the living women artists, speak for themselves in this exhibition, which otherwise I was worried would be very blokey and very sort of bro-y with, Turner and Ruskin and all of these kinds of just like men in frock coats dictating art history.
The radicals that you've chosen definitely do break that up. But I really wanted to ask you, or to know more about why you chose, what was the driver behind choosing these women? Was it pulling artists out of your collection, or was it to do with how kind of like trailblazing each of these women was in their own way?
It was a bit of both. So we have, the core of it was that we have this Ethel Walker seascape. And Ethel Walker is such a fantastic character in that she exhibited at the Venice Biennale. She was so recognized in her own time it's sort of a question mark over how many times. You get about 3 different numbers, how many times she actually represented the UK at the Venice Biennale. It's either 2, 4, or 6, depending on who you ask, and different years for all of them. I love this. But we have that. We have, as an organization, as the Walker, has been collecting women artists since before we even opened our doors. So we have this stunning collection of artworks by women, which have been in the collection since the 1870s. And so there's this real core history for the organization to collect and exhibit women artists. So we had those to begin with. But then my background is 19th century art. I love Annie Swinnerton. I think she's a fantastic character. I knew that Manchester had this amazing piece, but also it was the way that some of their work, Annie Swinnerton in particular, she writes about the sun, and she's traveling in similar places. And what I didn't want to try and do was just go matchy that, this is the same view or this is the same painting, but to think about how women might have engaged in different ways with this legacy. So Annie Swinnerton writes about the sun, and she essentially worships the sun in this sort of the same way that Turner says the sun is God. And so it's about the quality of light and the relationship to space and the landscape. And then you have somebody like Bridget Riley, who apparently hates Turner, doesn't like his work at all. But her Sea Cloud that we acquired through the John Morse Prize, it was one of these things that it was sort of fortuitous. I knew in my gut it needed to be in the show, but it took about 6 months of development to figure out why I couldn't let this painting go from the exhibition. And then I put the loan requests in for a couple of Turner Venice watercolors and realized that it's the same color palette as his late Turner watercolors. And so there's this moment for Turner where he's becoming more and more abstract. Mm-hmm. Not that he would ever have used this phrase. He always understood it as very figural and representative. But to think about the ways that color becomes unmoored necessarily from representative form. And so to have Bridget Riley as this pop artist, this wholly abstract, using fundamentally the same color palette in a body of work around travel, made it all of a sudden, I just went, well, that's what it was. That's why that has been sitting there. But so to not just think about a one-to-one, this is somebody trying to do Turner, but to think about how women artists have always been pushing that boundary, pushing that edge of modernism, contemporary art in different ways that relate in different levels. And so the Ethel Walker's the same thing. She paints on plein air. She might have seen herself more in the inheritance of Monet and the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists, but they were all directly inspired by Turner themselves. So it's these different layers of including women in the dialogue, not necessarily in a direct one-to-one, but to really incorporate them into that history of art in a way that they've always been there. They've always been doing these things with their painting or their printmaking or their drawing. They just always haven't been exhibited in the same room, or they've had an asterisk going, oh, well, this is our one woman. And so I'm trying in the actual exhibition space to not draw, they're not handled any differently. It's just, here's a Lucian Pizarro, here's an Ethel Walker, here's an Annie Swinnerton, here's a Turner. They're all in that dialogue together.
Because that seems to be a very common thread, being undone. Mm-hmm. But a very common thread with women artists who we see now exhibited on par in the way that they should be is superstars of their day, then we never heard of them again. And it feels like that's another with the not living artists that are in the show. It seems to be that obviously we know Ethel Walker, we know the names, but they're not on a par with people who probably were as successful or less successful in their day as were their contemporaries.
Exactly. Annie Swinnerton was one of the most successful. She was one of the first women Royal Academicians. So is Ethel Walker. They were hugely successful. And I actually have a t-shirt that I had made that says Clement Greenberg has a lot to answer for. Because it is in fact that direct rejection in modernism that subjects women, that kicks them out of the narrative of the great male genius, doing flatness for the first time. And Turner comes up in these discourses. And so it's about, to put my ex-teacher hat on, it's the historiography about these, that they haven't really been erased. They just weren't the subject, and slowly not being the star meant that they got put in the storerooms. And so this has been a real opportunity to re-center them in that discourse, in these narratives that they were always a part of. They just haven't necessarily been reincorporated fully, if that makes sense. And it's not in a way, I don't see it. The one artist that I did end up putting in, because I didn't have space, was Elizabeth Campbell, who we acquired. We're the first, nobody's heard of her. I hadn't heard of her. This is the one I will actually go, she's a rediscovery. She's brand new, but she was an 18th and 19th century watercolor landscape amateur who traveled around Europe, following Turner almost exactly, visiting all the same places. The problem is they're not very good. They're very charming, but they are very amateur. But I just didn't have space for it in this sort of narrative. But she is one where that is a real rediscovery, and it was because they stayed in the family. They were never exhibited. So she is an interesting character in that she actually crosses Mont Blanc on foot. She's the first woman to have done this. But so we're the first collection to have actually acquired these, but they didn't quite fit in sort of the historical scope of the exhibition, which is one of the problems with exhibition making, is you sort of set yourself these rules, and then every once in a while you have to go, but that means I can't have this.
I guess what you were saying kind of speaks to the history of gender imbalance in art history and collecting habits, because often women artists, even if they had a moment of success during their lifetimes, in posterity there was less care around the work, putting it into collections, or they actually just weren't cared for. They went missing, they were damaged. And with Turner, obviously he bequeathed all of his remaining works, a huge amount of works, to the state, and that he knew that would preserve his legacy as well. So I think, in a way, even if some of the connections between these contemporary women artists and modern women artists with Turner in some ways is not so literal and direct, it's about attaching their obscured names with his name to help boost their kind of visibility.
Exactly.
So it's kind of rebalancing art history, perhaps.
Yes. I'm going to do one thing. I'm going to look down the camera and I'm going to say, women artists, establish your estate, keep your records, and talk to museums about preserving your archive. It will make everybody's life easier. Do it. So the one thing is we don't have records for a lot of these women. So Annie Swinnerton, we think, might have burnt her letters. There's a few scattered in other people's archives. So part of it is this posterity. It's the record keeping, where, you know, Turner gave his work to the state. There were issues with the bequest, but it is that preservation of the record and the archive that has made it easier for some artists to be preserved at that volume.
Yeah.
And it's just financially as well. I think you couldn't buy a house without a man until the 60s, 70s as a woman. So I think a lot of the records are financial, aren't they? And a lot of financial records were only in the names of men.
Yeah. And also, if we flip it, when Ruskin looked at the collection that was left of Turner's works, there was a controversy that he found all of this erotica and all of these things that needed to perhaps be, you know, remain in the shadows at that time, but history still preserved his legacy, and they were hidden to not damage the reputation or the value of his works. Whereas I feel like that just wouldn't happen the same way for a women artist.
No, I think if somebody had preserved Annie Swinnerton's archive and found quite a lot of raunchy little drawings, that it wouldn't have been collected in the 1920s, 30s when she died. That would have just been fully expunged. But there is a real problem for women in particular whose families may have found exactly this kind of thing, references to sex, references to class. I mean, even slightly bitchy comments about people might have been an opportunity for families to expunge that from the archive, because they wanted to preserve that reputation for the women, that appearance of gentility, especially for a middle class artist like Swinnerton, where that is so important, even though her whole career was an artist. And I think part of it is that there's a real assumption that there were only a very small number of women artists. But it was really there were actually hundreds, if not thousands. They just didn't ever achieve that level of fame. And that's part of the other side of it, is you have a megastar like Turner. I mean, there are 24, 25 Turner exhibitions happening this year because of his, it's a lot. Loans were very competitive. Because he's, turning 250, but he's such an icon. He's such a central figure. But can't think of any women that would have this. There are very few male artists that would have. Constable is also turning 250 this year, and there are, I think, 3 exhibitions, and one of those is shared with Turner. So there is a real power imbalance in the scare quotes, star quality of the artists who get remembered and commemorated like this, in part because Turner left 40 some odd thousand paintings, drawings, sketchbooks, watercolors, all curated by Ruskin. But just because of that fame that he had in his lifetime, that Annie Swinnerton had a major memorial exhibition. Ethel Walker had a major memorial exhibition. Yeah. An artist who didn't fit in the exhibition, but we have represented, Mary McCrossan, who was local, had a touring memorial exhibition. It went around the UK because she was so famous. And now it's basically us and the Atkinson who remember her and exhibit her. So it is that falling off for lots of artists where that fame level, Watts is the same way.
I wonder what extent it is that the families, the descendants of the families, it's a female artist. Oh, she couldn't have been important. She doesn't mean much. They're cluttering up the attic, let's get rid of them. But it was a male artist. They'd be perceived as a professional, something to keep and treasure.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is whether or not they had children as well. Annie Swinnerton didn't have kids. Mary McCrossan never got married, didn't have kids. Ethel Walker was a lesbian, didn't have kids. So there's not necessarily even an extended family to do that, to make that decision in that case. Annie Swinnerton outlived her husband. Ethel Walker left it to a friend who became the manager of her estate. He was an expatriate who'd come over from Europe because of World War II. So I think it is very much about that shepherding of that legacy.
Yeah. And I guess, 19th century, early 20th century, there was a scarcity of women art historians, critics, curators. Whereas if you look at Turner, he had Ruskin championing him in his sort of mid-career, later life. And you see that's quite common with lots of star male artists. So you have to wonder who were the people really championing the women. I think there were more obstacles in trying to be taken seriously because I guess it was less likely they had these really significant high-profile patrons or mentors.
Yeah, and I think it's especially if they were themselves middle class, a lot of times it was the networks of women. So Annie Swinnerton had Isabel Dacher. Other artists would have their circles or their friends of their supporter circles of patrons, but they were oftentimes, also middle class. They didn't have the sort of art cultural clout. Even if they were acquired by somebody like the royal family as a one-off, that didn't necessarily convert to, they might get an obituary, but they weren't going to be heralded in the same way and supported and set up with that because of these issues. They don't have Ruskin. They don't have, all these generations of artists actively imitating them. We've just put on James Baker Pine, who nobody's really heard of now because he was a Victorian artist, but was one of Turner's most successful followers. And I think, in fact, one of the artists who potentially did one of our fake Turners. But so if they don't have these schools of students who then become followers or supporters, I think that is actually very much it. But we bought our Ethel Walkers essentially from her in the 30s and 50s. Mm-hmm. So there was this, they were being collected. They've just been relegated over the years. She was huge.
Was your Dame Ethel Walker? Yeah.
And she was one of the first women to receive the Order of the British Empire for her services to the arts. And I think one of only 4 until about the 90s, in fact. They were so rare. And she was also apparently a massively prickly character. Nobody at the RA actually liked her because she was so opinionated and difficult to get along with. But she was also so good that they had to acknowledge her. She also has a potentially apocryphal quote, which is that there's no such thing as a woman artist. There's only 2 kinds of artists, good and bad, which she apparently said at the inaugural meeting of the Society for Female Artists, where she was elected their honorary president. And she only sort of did it out of, well, I guess I kind of have to. But
yeah, but in a sense, it's good to remember that quote in the context of this exhibition, that the women are here because of their quality. Yeah. They are superb artists. And I think that's something that needs to be reinforced, that these sort of lesser known, not household name women artists who've fallen from history, not fallen from history, but have been relegated to the footnotes of history, deserve to be there because of their merit and because they're good. Yeah. Not just because they're women and they're sort of, ticking some kind of box. So I think that's an important thing to stress as well.
Yeah. I think that's a huge part of it. Is one of the things that the whole exhibition has struggled with is putting things next to Turner's. You've got, he produced a lot, so not everything is going to hold a wall by itself, but trying to put anybody next to, the Wreck Boy is difficult because these paintings are so good that it's very difficult. So to be able to put Annie Swinnerton next to a Turner and have it hold its own, I think is going to do a huge amount of the visual argument that this is very, very good. These are stunning paintings, and we're really hoping to invite people, because most of them are glazed. I'm a big believer in encouraging people to get right up to the glass wherever possible, that the interpretation is indicating to people that they should look and think about the quality of the artwork and what makes it good and how has it been made from an art historical perspective. And the Ethel Walker is going to sit next to, I think it sits, I'm trying to remember the layouts, it sits between, a Courbet and a Lucien Pizarro, and it absolutely holds its own. It is equally good, but it also shows these inheritances that these women weren't coming out sort of ex nihilo. They weren't coming out of nowhere. They were deeply embedded in the art historical traditions, and that they're equally potent in engaging with these and playing with these things.
Absolutely. Thinking about Turner and artists such, even though he's a unique artist such as Turner, that we tend to almost use as a kind of a marker, a way of bringing things out of the canon, a way of bringing things out of the cupboard. And maybe it's great we have that focus, we have his beloved artist, household name, and maybe in a way using them as a reference to highlight other artists is a really powerful way of using that legacy, using that enormous bequest and the amount of shows and history and documentation that we have on him. And it can be viewed as a negative or a positive,
Yeah, I think that was when we were doing our programming meetings to sign off an exhibition. We have a slide, a sort of thing in the document that says, what are the weaknesses or the potential problems for a show like this? And the number one thing is it's yet another dead male white artist. But I think that's exactly right. It is this opportunity to use his cachet to get people through the door to see a Maggie Hambling and a Bridget Riley, and we haven't mentioned the ceramics works that we've got. I think I've actually shoehorned in another woman since I sent everybody the documents, to get them to look at new things and to think about things in different ways. And sort of my curatorial motto is get people to accidentally learn something. You come to see a Turner because it's the anniversary, and you accidentally learn about Ethel Walker, or Bridget Riley or Annie Swinnerton in these other conversations that are being had, and to use that to not just put up, here is our massive collection of Turners in chronological order, but to try and do something to get people to think differently about unfamiliar names has been I think that's been the real opportunity of an anniversary like this.
That is good because, certain museum and gallery visitors will only turn up for the blockbusters, won't they? The big names, the household names. So the way that you can slide in lesser known artists, but who have enormous merit, where that people wouldn't go and see them if they were the headline name. It is really good. It's an excellent opportunity.
And I think there's been a real sea change over the past few years. I mean, even since the pandemic, really, around the name recognition of women artists. I think the big Tate exhibition that happened last year, the touring exhibitions have done a lot of good in getting people to, maybe women artists are worth looking at. I don't think that they put on a show like this, but to sort of, I think it's an incremental step to get people, we've sort of been joking that for the marketing campaign, we're going to put a Turner on the poster and it's just going to say Turner in all caps and be really punchy, because there is a huge audience that will just come because it says Turner. And God love those people. I hope they all buy tickets. But that, trying to also get in people who maybe wouldn't go see a Turner exhibition because, well, they're just sort of fluffy bits of nothing, some of them. But trying to go, this is something else. It does include these women. It does include names that you maybe haven't heard of, or maybe you have heard of, but not thought about in relation to Turner. And then once we've got them in, to get them thinking about class and gender and climate and colonialism, but also, because my background is close looking, my background is as a really sort of object-based art historian, to get them to look at the things themselves and to not just sort of go, okay, well, there's the big picture, but to look at a tiny detail and to see how, a detail of a blue and white china cup the size of my pinky nail ties out to colonialism in a way that leads to a Christine Borland piece around, human skulls and blue and white pottery, to the Brexit-ware china that responds to these immediately contemporary socio-political issues from something that was painted in sort of 1824 for a rich patron also connects to these different things.
There was something that Lydia actually raised earlier today, which was, and Turner, another reason why having this kind of body of like information and legacy about this artist is really useful. In his long life, he actually changed his mind about some of these issues, such as slavery. So, I mean, he was an investor, and then he went to being an abolitionist, like probably a lot of people. But having that record, I think, is really useful. And in an exhibition like this, it tells its own story of a changing time within a lifetime.
Yeah. And part of what we were limited by is, because I'm trying so hard to keep everything rooted in the things that you can see in the picture, or things that are sort of at least closely tangential enough, is that, we weren't able to borrow something like the slave ship from MFA Boston. It would have been phenomenal, but to be able to pull things out about this through something like cigarette cards, these material bits of, they're worth about £1.50 on eBay, because they were mass-produced bits of stuff that were used to stiffen cigarette packets. But there was a whole series produced that had Turners on them. So something like that allows the exhibition to bring out these stories around his investment in, a slave-operated farm in Jamaica. It allows that to be connected to something really physical that they can see in a display case, that it's not an abstract historical footnote, but it relates to the things that they're looking at, not just pictorially, but to these legacies as well. And so I'm hoping that that's the kind of thing, that this is an exhibition that will allow that to percolate up.
I noticed you have some items which I was really interested in as well, like the DMs.
Yes, that is my collection of stuff I've bought on eBay. I love them. They make me really happy.
I've got a pair. I was thinking of wearing them today, but it was a bit too hot. Yeah, Turner DMs.
How did you choose these contemporary objects, like related to Turner, using his work?
Things I could buy on eBay or Etsy, but also things that I, as a person whose whole personality is art related, that they were the kinds of things that I didn't buy them when they first came out because I couldn't afford them, but they're the things that I thought said something about Turner's legacy outside of the walls of the museum, that there's something about him and his paintings being on Doc Martens, being on a sweater from Bershka, that they talk about how accessible he is as an artist, but also the way that people who aren't art historians or curators see art as something that they can curate themselves, and literally sort of curate themselves in the act of curating, but also curate their self around this kind of material culture. And I think Turner's such a good figure for that, because he's quite literally on the £20 note. He is so widely recognizable that he becomes a really interesting figure. He's like the Impressionists in a way, in that he is so merchandisable, but that makes him a really interesting in point for people who maybe don't feel welcome in a museum, but love art, and they can buy this on a t-shirt, or they can buy it on a jumper, or they can buy it on a tote bag, or the commemorative stamps, and find their ways into a relationship with this historic artwork.
I think he would have loved it.
I think he
as
absolutely-
long as he was getting a cut.
Yes.
Because he was all about the book.
Yeah, he was very
Yeah.
entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
That is one of the things that we've also tried to pull out, is that this is not art for art's sake. This is, you know, he wanted money, and I respect that. That he was a sound businessman, and he, you know, he was so canny, and that we've got things where we've got 3 versions of the picture in the exhibition, because he, you know, he made a watercolor, then he made a print, and then he made a painting, all for different markets to make himself accessible to, you know, yes, he tried to sell a painting to, you know, the King and Queen of England, but he also wanted people to be able to buy prints so that he could get a cut of it, and so that he would be famous, and so that his legacy would be supported. And it's that multifaceted, you know, yes, he's making a buck, yes, it's this creative endeavor, but he is also so concerned with his legacy.
I mean, the other thing that's interesting about him is, beyond being the sort of entrepreneurial kind of strategic artist, when he accrued that amount of wealth and fame, it did allow him to be more experimental.
Yes.
And then create works that people thought was sort of abhorrent, and they were questioning, why are you painting in this style? And it wasn't actually very popular. So I think that's also what's interesting.
Soap suds, wasn't it? Seafoam
Yeah.
and soap suds, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a real degree of, he also had such a long and diverse career that you see, we've got one of his very early Monroe School watercolors that he might have done with Thomas Girton, which is this very monochrome. You know, he's doing it in his very early 20s, all the way through to the painting of the Wreck Boy, which, you know, is described, Ruskin describes it as the last painting he finished before his hand lost its genius, and he sort of dissolves into soap suds and fluffiness. But I think that he's the financial support that he has allows him to push those boundaries, and I think that's a real sort of, as you said, canny sense that this is something that he is allowed to do this because of his success, even if then nobody buys it. But there were audiences for it. Some of the works that have come into our collection were through the Holt family in Sudley, that they acquired late Turners, one of the first sort of family collections to do so regularly. But again, this is something the catalog is able to bring out, is they were able to buy Turners because they made all of their money in cotton. And if not directly in cotton and slave-produced empires, they also were a shipping family. So the money that allowed them to buy these experimental artworks, one of which was a forgery, was, you know, the direct impact of colonialism and slavery. And so it's interesting that, you know, he did change his mind, but then he was still being acquired by, you know, slave-owning people. And Ruskin in particular is quite problematic about this, because he had these full-throated defense of American chattel slavery for incredibly racist reasons that the Ruskin scholarship does not like to talk about at all. But there is that tension. But he is so concerned with his legacy and with financial support, potentially because he came from, you know, a working class background. He had relatives to support, but also because he wanted to found the Turner Prize. He wanted, well, what became the Turner Prize. He wanted to found a home for indigent senior artists as a way of giving back. So I think that's one of the things that I love about the 19th century in general, is this real tension between some of the worst human impulses, but also some of the best, and that real reactionary and reformist character that he really emblematizes. And I think that's one of the things that I find really interesting about having a Turner exhibition like this, is being able to pull some of these things out in different ways, and then using the women to talk about these kinds of things. I haven't found a quote from him about a women painter yet. I don't know if I want to go digging that much further, because he might disappoint me a little bit.
Yeah, his relationship with women was always problematic. They're never of his social standing, or what the social standing he got to. He almost, you know, preys on women who were vulnerable.
Yeah.
Anyway,
This is, that we don't bring out so much, unfortunately. But it is, I think that is a really interesting point around his relationship with women. And we just don't get into it because it's not so much about his biography as so much the paintings and his legacy.
Yeah, I don't know
But
that he ever
it
left
is-
any statements about it.
Not that I've been able to find, but my favorite thing is that I had one of my section headers. I was like, this is a great quote from Turner. I'll absolutely use this. It's actually from Oscar Wilde. And it was something about the power of the sea. and it turns out to have been fully misattributed for decades. That it sounds like the kind of thing Turner would say, but it was in fact Oscar Wilde, quite securely attributed in a play. And so I think this is part of this lionizing or this legendary character that he has, that so many things he said, did he actually say them? Or has somebody gone, oh, we can make Turner say this because he's been dead for a while?
Always leads back to Oscar Wilde.
Always
doesn't
leads
it?
back to always
Too many
Oscar
quotes out there
Wilde.
from Oscar Wilde.
Misattributed quotes of today, especially in the age of Instagram, is just wild. But it's one of my favourite things. It's a very obviously misattributed quote.
Yeah, this one, to be fair, was quite good. It was the right tone of voice. It was, but once you started sort of digging a little bit, so I've gotten very paranoid about double checking all of the quotes. But it's like that Ethel Walker quote: "Nobody can give me a page number in an archive." It seems to be a real sort of, urban legend that she said this. And then Prunella Clough, who's another artist who I couldn't quite fit in, but also did these really interesting sort of 60s abstract landscapes, had almost an identical quote around "there's no such thing as a woman artist." So it seems to be this legend, or this sort of, it's such a good quote that I don't know if it was something that was in the zeitgeist of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s around early feminism, or if one person said something and then that bon mot got sort of passed around all of the famous women artists. But this is sort of the issue of working on women with interesting archives.
One thing I was thinking about, going back to what you were saying about Turner being not having that great a relationship with the women in his life, was I was wondering what drove all of these quite trailblazing. I mean, you would even if they wouldn't call themselves feminist, we would look back on them as feminists and feminist artists. They all in some way were drawn to his work and his legacy. They must have known exactly what he was like. What do you think draws these women to Turner?
I think it's something that, for what I would, to use the sort of problematic term, great artists, it's the idea that Turner represents this is going to be some quite wanky art talk, a visual vocabulary of experimentation, light, color, these kinds of things that allows them, despite the fact that he was probably a really horrible person to be around, particularly at the end of his life, his art and his practice represents a discourse of art making that is so productive around color relationships, paint, the sheer application of paint, that if you want to do something that isn't Monet, essentially, Turner becomes this really powerful body of work to represent. And he was also so accessible to them from the 1850s onwards that he has never been off display in London. There has always been, I think, except maybe during World War II and after the flood that damaged quite a lot of the works at Tate, they've always been accessible, and they've always been major works, have always been accessible. The watercolors have been available. He's such a monumental figure that if you wanted to respond to something, or if you wanted to engage in these discourses of British landscape painting, that's the guy you go to. And I think it puts them in dialogue with, Camille Pissarro, Lucien Pissarro, Monet, Van Gogh, all of these other people that orbit around him, that he becomes this linchpin for referentiality, for study, for imitation, that you don't have to necessarily go it alone. And we talk a lot about, this great quote from Rothko about, this man Turner, he learned a lot from me, which is also a slight paraphrase that Tate have on their wall. But it's this idea that he is a body of work that you can learn from, and essentially a shortcut to see how he's engaging with these things. And I think that's a huge part of it, is you don't have to start from scratch. You can go to Turner and learn from him. And Camille Pissarro writes to Lucien, that you must go study these very carefully and learn how he does these. Among everybody else, Turner is the one who understands light and shadow the way that we understand as Impressionists. And so I think he becomes this real case study and he's somebody that the abstract expressionists or the impressionists find a visual vocabulary in, even if he himself would not have understood or respected or been pleased about that relationship. He's such such a body of work for artists to turn to.
Is also a state of mind. I think he was always experimenting. What's a new pigment? I want to try it out. I want to see the boundaries of it. What's the new paper? What can I make that do? How far can I push this with my audiences, with myself? He was a workaholic. He never stopped working. So I think this you can observe a need to drive forward and push through barriers. I think that's what's inspiring as well for everybody.
I think Turner probably gave permission to other artists who followed him to experiment and to be more radical. And I think, he anticipated the Impressionists and abstraction in the 20th century, I guess. So I imagine maybe some of those women regarded him as this sort of maverick figure who could shake things up, and it could give them confidence to perhaps follow in his footsteps.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's that permission, even if it's sort of taken permission rather than given permission. That I think
inadvertently gave that permission.
Yes. I think that's a really interesting sort of idea of taking an artist, he died in 1851. He's been dead for such a long time that his body of work has given so many generations of artists permission to try new things or to find new vocabularies, that he has continually had this opportunity or given people this opportunity to reinvent themselves. And so I'm really hoping that that's what sort of people take out of the exhibition. So I'm wondering if anybody has any sort of final thoughts on that, on women or Turner in general, the point of doing Turner in 2025.
Just after looking through the images of the works that will be in the show by all these women that I could find, I was struck by these skies and this amazing treatment of water and light, and how, as we said, accomplished these works are. One work that keeps standing out in my mind is the maybe going to be retitled Italian Landscape by Swinnerton, and just this amazing almost like this luminescence. It's an often used word, but it is a very luminescent work, and still in her kind of these kind of moody kind of very emotional portraits of her hometown. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yes, good. And that kind of reaction and legacy of his work I just find so beautiful in all the images that you've chosen for paintings.
I'm circling back to Bridget Riley, and I must admit, of all the ones you chose, when I first saw her name come up, I thought Melissa's lost the plot. You couldn't get a more programmatic artist versus Turner. Colour. And then I thought, yes, colour. And you wrote this in the catalogue. And he was obsessive with colour and juxtapositions of colour and working with colour, and then limiting himself down, didn't he, in his later years after his Italian period, to these three colours, red, yellow and blue, and white. And I thought, yes, after her visit to Egypt, wasn't it, 1980? And then for 5 years or so, Riley became obsessed with, again, it was a limited 5 colours plus black and white, and how they looked together and how that made you feel. Did you get a sense of what she saw when she was in Egypt, the colours, the light and everything? So I thought, yes, ostensibly when you see it you think that's not going to work, but I bet it does.
It's on a bright pink wall as well.
Hooray!
I guess I'd say, I think when you stand in front of a Turner, I think it's really important to have that closer inspection, as you were saying, like really look at the texture and the technique. I think we're so used to seeing paintings as digital images in this kind of online culture we live in. And I think seeing a show like this and these Turner works, I'm sure artists are still learning from the surface of his canvases today and can see the brilliance of and the mastery of how he captured light and colour. So I think putting that next to these women artists and seeing their technique next to his is really important. And I think that's going to be a strength of the show.
I hope so. Well, thank you so much for what was, I think, a great discussion. And I'm really hoping that you come back to see the exhibition and get to see some of these things in person, because I think they do actually, it is like you say, it's hard to see them in reproduction when they have such dimension to them and they have such a life to them as objects, as things a person made, alongside the Turners and everything else. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.